The most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming you know a man's worth from the papers sitting in front of him. The divorce attorney slid the final document across the polished walnut table at exactly 10:14 on a gray Thursday morning in downtown Chicago. Ethan Walker looked at the signature line for a long moment before reaching for the pen. Across from him, his former wife sat with her arms folded and her attention fixed on the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt old, worn smooth by years of conversations that had already happened. Beside Ethan sat Lily, 7 years old, her small hands wrapped around a white stuffed rabbit whose ears had been stitched back together more than once. She swung her feet beneath the chair and watched her father carefully. Ethan signed the document without hesitation. No anger. No visible regret. No speech about second chances. Just a steady signature and a quiet nod to the attorney. At the far end of the conference suite, another meeting had just concluded. Victoria Hayes stepped into the hallway accompanied by 2 associates from Hayes Capital. At 32, she had built a reputation as one of the sharpest CEOs in the city. She noticed details automatically. Expensive watches. Tailored jackets. Confidence. Weakness. Success left clues, and so did failure. As she passed the glass wall of the conference room, her eyes drifted inside. She saw Ethan in a faded blue shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. She saw the worn leather shoes. She saw the little girl holding a stuffed rabbit. She saw divorce papers. Her gaze lingered for only a second before she smiled faintly and kept walking. One of her associates glanced through the glass as well. "Rough day for somebody," he said quietly. Victoria's smile widened slightly. "Looks like life made a decision for him." Neither of them noticed the attorney standing near the door freeze for half a heartbeat after hearing Ethan's name. Inside the room, Ethan gathered the paperwork and placed it carefully into a plain manila envelope. Lily looked up at him. "Are we done?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "We're done." "Are you sad?" she asked. The attorney lowered his eyes toward the table. Ethan considered the question seriously. "No," he finally said. "Sometimes finishing something is different from losing it." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer. She hugged the rabbit against her chest and climbed down from the chair. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The city moved beneath layers of steel and glass. People hurried between meetings. Deals were signed. Fortunes changed hands. Nobody paid attention to the quiet man leaving the law office with a child beside him. Nobody noticed the black SUV waiting across the street. Nobody noticed the driver stepping out the moment Ethan appeared. And nobody noticed the expression on the attorney's face as he watched Ethan walk away, because the attorney knew something Victoria Hayes did not. The signature Ethan Walker had just placed on those divorce papers would set events into motion that would soon reach far beyond a family courtroom, far beyond a broken marriage, and far beyond anything anyone in that building believed possible. The black SUV merged into late-morning traffic without drawing attention. Ethan sat in the rear seat beside Lily while the city drifted past the rain-streaked windows. Neither of them spoke for several blocks. Lily eventually rested her stuffed rabbit against the glass and watched the building slide by. "Can we still get pancakes on Saturday?" she asked. Ethan looked over at her. "Of course." "Even after today?" she asked. "Especially after today." Lily nodded and seemed content with that answer. For her, the future was measured in school days, pancakes, and whether her father would be there when she woke up. Ethan intended to keep all three unchanged. Across downtown Chicago, Victoria Hayes stepped into the executive conference room on the 34th floor of Hayes Capital. The room overlooked Lake Michigan, gray beneath the clouds. 12 executives waited around the table. A major acquisition meeting had been scheduled for weeks. Victoria placed a folder on the polished surface and immediately took control of the discussion. Numbers appeared on large screens. Forecasts were reviewed. Timelines were confirmed. Everything proceeded exactly as expected until her chief legal officer quietly cleared his throat. "There is one issue," he said. The room became still. "What issue?" Victoria asked. "The final approval has not been received." "From whom?" "The outside stakeholder group." Victoria frowned. "I was told everything was completed." The attorney hesitated. "Almost everything." He turned a page. "One signature remains outstanding." Victoria disliked surprises. "Then get it." The attorney exchanged a brief glance with another executive. "We have been trying." Something about his tone caused several people at the table to look up. "Who are we waiting on?" Victoria asked. The attorney checked the document again. E. Walker. The name meant nothing to her. And why exactly is E. Walker holding up a $300 million transaction? No one immediately answered. The silence lasted slightly too long. Meanwhile, 40 miles outside the city, Ethan's SUV turned into a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with maple trees and brick homes. Nothing about the street suggested unusual wealth. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Lawns were trimmed. Mailboxes stood in neat rows. Ethan unlocked the front door of a modest two-story house and carried Lily's backpack inside. The house was clean, organized, and surprisingly ordinary. Lily ran upstairs to place her rabbit on her bed before returning to the kitchen. Ethan opened the refrigerator and began preparing lunch. The routine looked practiced. Comfortable. Familiar. "Dad?" Lily called from the table. "Yes?" "Are grown-ups supposed to look sad after they sign those papers?" Ethan paused for a moment before answering. "Sometimes." "You do not." A faint smile appeared. "That is because a piece of paper does not decide who you are." Lily considered this carefully. Back downtown, Victoria's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. The incoming call came from a senior partner at one of the largest law firms in Illinois. She answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. When it ended, her expression had changed. "What happened?" one executive asked. Victoria slowly lowered the phone. 4. The first time that morning, uncertainty entered the room. "That is interesting," she said quietly. "Apparently someone named Ethan Walker just became very important to our deal." The conference room remained quiet long after Victoria lowered her phone. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. In her experience, people usually spoke when they were uncomfortable. The fact that nobody did told her something she did not like. Several people at the table already knew more than she did. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair. "Start from the beginning," she said. The chief legal officer adjusted his glasses. "The acquisition requires approval from a minority stakeholder structure established almost 12 years ago." "And?" Victoria asked. "Most of the ownership records are held through trusts, private entities, and voting agreements." "That is not unusual." "No," he said carefully. "What is unusual is who controls them." Another silence followed. Victoria looked around the table. "Then tell me." The attorney opened a folder. "The final authority belongs to Ethan Walker." Across the room, one executive slowly exhaled. Another lowered his eyes to the table. Victoria noticed both reactions immediately. "You are telling me the man from the law office?" she asked. "Yes." "The same man signing divorce papers this morning?" "Yes." She stared at the documents. None of it fit the picture she had formed only hours earlier. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the afternoon exactly the way he spent most afternoons. He helped Lily with her math homework at the kitchen table. He fixed a loose cabinet hinge in the pantry. He answered 2 phone calls that lasted less than 3 minutes each. Nothing about his behavior suggested urgency. Nothing suggested wealth. Nothing suggested power. The only unusual thing was the number of messages accumulating unanswered on his phone. By 4 o'clock, there were 14. Lily sat across from him working through multiplication problems. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes?" "Why do grown-ups always want to call you?" Ethan looked at the screen for a moment before turning it face down. "Sometimes people need help." "Do you help them?" "Sometimes." "Do they say thank you?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Not always." Lily thought about that and returned to her worksheet. Nearly an hour later, a black sedan stopped outside Hayes' Capital headquarters. A gray-haired man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. Within minutes he was sitting across from Victoria in her office. His name was Richard Collins, senior partner at one of the most influential law firms in the Midwest. He did not waste time with small talk. He placed a file on her desk. "Before you make any decisions regarding Ethan Walker, you should read this." Victoria opened the folder. The first page contained almost nothing. No photographs. No biography. Just a list of company names. The second page contained more names. The third page contained aviation assets. The fourth contained logistics holdings. The deeper she read, the quieter the room became. Finally she looked up. "This cannot be right." Richard folded his hands. "It is." Victoria glanced back at the pages. One detail stood out among all the numbers. Private aviation. Multiple aircraft. Long-range operations. International routes. She remembered the faded shirt. The worn shoes. The little girl holding a stuffed rabbit. None of it matched. "Why does he live like that?" she asked quietly. Richard's answer came without hesitation. "Because the people who truly have power rarely feel the need to display it." The next morning began before sunrise. A thin layer of fog hung over the neighborhood as Ethan stood in the kitchen pouring orange juice into a small glass. Lily sat at the table wearing a blue sweater and carefully feeding pieces of toast to the stuffed rabbit balanced beside her cereal bowl. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ethan's phone rested face down near the coffee maker. It had received 23 calls since midnight. He had answered none of them. "Dad?" Lily asked. "Yes?" "Do important people get a lot of phone calls?" Ethan glanced at her. "Sometimes." "You get a lot." He poured coffee into a mug. "That does not always mean they are important." Lily accepted the answer and returned to her breakfast. Across the city, Victoria Hayes was already in her office. She had slept less than 4 hours. The file Richard Collins left behind sat open on her desk. Every page raised new questions. Aviation holdings. Distribution networks. International freight operations. Investment partnerships stretching across multiple states. Yet nowhere could she find a photograph of Ethan standing beside a luxury car, a private yacht, or any of the symbols she normally associated with wealth. The absence bothered her more than the numbers themselves. At 8:15, her executive assistant entered carrying a tablet. "You asked for everything we could find." Victoria looked up. "And? There is almost nothing." "That is impossible." "That is what we thought." The assistant placed the tablet on the desk. "No interviews. No social media. No public appearances. No magazine profiles. No speaking engagements." Victoria frowned. "A man controls assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars and nobody talks about him? Apparently he prefers it that way." The assistant hesitated. There is one thing, though. Victoria leaned forward. What? Everyone we contacted described him the same way. Which is? Quiet. The answer lingered in the room longer than expected. Meanwhile, Ethan drove Lily to school in the same SUV he had owned for years. Nothing about the vehicle attracted attention. Parents filled the drop-off lane. Children hurried toward the entrance carrying backpacks almost as large as they were. Ethan parked near the curb. Lily gathered her things and reached for the rabbit. Before opening the door, she paused. Are you coming to the science fair next week? Ethan looked at her seriously. Would I miss it? She smiled. No, then there is your answer. Lily nodded and climbed out. Several parents glanced toward Ethan. Most saw nothing unusual. One father did. He watched Ethan for a moment before quickly looking away. By noon, Victoria had made a decision. She wanted to meet Ethan Walker again. Not through lawyers. Not through advisors. Directly. Yet every attempt to arrange a meeting met the same response. Polite refusals. Full schedules. Delayed timelines. It was as though an invisible wall surrounded him. Then shortly after 1 o'clock, a message arrived from Richard Collins. Just one sentence. Victoria read it twice. Her expression changed immediately. The message said, if you truly want to understand Ethan Walker, do not watch his companies. Watch where he goes tomorrow morning. The following morning, Victoria arrived 30 minutes earlier than Richard Collins had suggested. The address he provided was not a corporate headquarters, an airport terminal, or an investment office. It was an elementary school on the north side of the city. She remained inside her car across the street and watched parents arrive one by one. Minivans. Pickup trucks. Sedans carrying children half awake and carrying oversized backpacks. Nothing seemed unusual. Then at exactly 7:42 in the morning, Ethan's SUV pulled into the drop-off lane. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Ethan stepped out first. He opened the passenger door and waited while Lily climbed down holding her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. The two of them stood beside the vehicle for a moment. Lily appeared to be explaining something important. Ethan listened carefully, giving her the same attention a chief executive might give a board presentation. When she finished, he nodded once. Lily smiled. Then she disappeared into the building. Ethan remained where he was for several seconds after she entered. Not checking his phone. Not rushing toward another appointment. Just watching until she was safely inside. Victoria found herself unexpectedly curious about that detail. Most powerful people she knew measured every minute. Ethan seemed to move according to a different clock entirely. After a few moments he returned to the SUV and drove away. Victoria followed at a distance. 20 minutes later, Ethan arrived at a modest office building near a freight rail corridor west of downtown. The structure was unremarkable. No large company logo. No luxury entrance. No signs of corporate prestige. Victoria parked across the street and watched. Employees greeted Ethan as he entered. What caught her attention was not their behavior. It was their expressions. Nobody looked intimidated. Nobody looked nervous. They looked relieved. Respect was common in business. Relief was different. 2 hours later Victoria was back in her office reviewing reports when another message arrived from Richard Collins. Attached was a single document. She opened it immediately. The first page contained a timeline. 12 years earlier, Ethan Walker had quietly acquired a struggling regional cargo company that most analysts expected to fail. 3 years later, he expanded it into neighboring states. 5 years later, it controlled critical transportation routes throughout the Midwest. The acquisitions continued. Air freight. Distribution centers. Logistics software. Warehousing networks. Every move appeared boring on its own. Together they formed something enormous. Victoria turned another page. Then another. The scale became impossible to ignore. Yet the final page contained no financial figures. Only a short handwritten note from Richard. It read, "Most people discover wealth and then build a life around it. Ethan built a life first and never changed it afterward." Victoria stared at the sentence for a long time. Then her assistant knocked on the door and stepped inside. "There is a problem," she said. Victoria looked up. "What happened?" The assistant placed a report on the desk. "The acquisition partners just informed us they will not proceed without Ethan Walker's approval." Victoria lowered her eyes to the report. For the second time in less than 48 hours, a room full of powerful people had reached the same conclusion. The man everyone overlooked was suddenly the one person nobody could afford to ignore. For the first time in years, Victoria Hayes found herself studying a person instead of a transaction. The difference was unsettling. Numbers followed rules. Markets followed incentives. People were less predictable. Especially people like Ethan Walker. By Thursday afternoon, every major partner involved in the acquisition had delivered the same message. Nothing moved forward without him. Victoria stood beside the windows of her office overlooking the city while her executive team debated contingency plans behind her. Alternative structures. Delayed timelines. Revised financing models. None of them solved the problem. Ethan's approval remained essential. "We can offer better terms," one executive suggested. "We already have," another replied. "Then increase the valuation." "That is not the issue." Victoria listened without speaking. Finally she turned around. "Has anyone actually spoken to him?" The room fell silent. A few people exchanged glances. "Not directly," someone admitted. Victoria nodded once. The answer confirmed what she already suspected. Everyone had been trying to negotiate around Ethan instead of with him. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the afternoon at a distribution facility outside Chicago. The building covered nearly 300,000 square feet. Trucks moved through loading bays. Workers checked manifests. Forklifts crossed polished concrete floors. Yet despite the scale of the operation, Ethan walked through the facility without an entourage. He greeted employees by name. He stopped to ask one worker about a sick parent. He congratulated another on the birth of a son. The conversations were brief. Genuine. Unforced. Near the back of the facility, a young operations manager approached him carrying a tablet. "The board wants your recommendation on the Southwest expansion." Ethan reviewed the numbers quietly. "Not yet," he said. "The infrastructure is not ready. The projections look strong." Ethan handed back the tablet. "Projections do not move freight. Infrastructure does." The manager nodded immediately and made a note. There was no argument. No need for one. Back at Hayes Capital, Victoria received another call from Richard Collins. "You are approaching this the wrong way," he told her. "Then tell me the right way." Richard was silent for a moment. "You still think the companies explain Ethan?" "They do not." "Then what does?" "His daughter." Victoria frowned. "What does that mean?" "Everything important in his life eventually traces back to her." Before she could ask another question, the call ended. Hours later, the meaning of those words began to reveal itself. A research report arrived from her analysts. Buried deep within years of financial records was a pattern. Every major business decision Ethan made seemed to coincide with personal milestones. School. Years. Family transitions. Stability. Long-term security. He had not built his empire around prestige. He had built it around protection. Victoria read the report twice. Then a third time. As evening settled over the city, she looked out the window again. Somewhere beyond the skyline, a man she had dismissed in a single glance was quietly influencing billion-dollar decisions without seeking attention, recognition, or status. And for the first time, Victoria began to realize that the most important mystery was not how much Ethan Walker owned. It was why a man with that much power seemed determined to live as though nobody needed to know it. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air moving in from the lake. Victoria followed Richard Collins's advice without fully understanding why. At 7:30, she parked near the private aviation terminal on the western edge of the city. The facility was quiet compared to the commercial airport. No crowds. No announcements. Just a handful of aircraft resting on the tarmac beneath the early sunlight. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then a familiar SUV entered through a secured gate. Victoria straightened in her seat. Ethan stepped out first. Lily climbed out beside him carrying her stuffed rabbit. The sight felt strangely ordinary. A father. A daughter. A quiet morning. Yet within seconds, the atmosphere around them changed. Ground personnel who had been moving equipment stopped what they were doing. A senior operations manager emerged from the terminal entrance. Another executive followed behind him. None of them rushed. None of them appeared nervous. But every person who approached Ethan carried the unmistakable posture of respect. Not because of his wealth. Because of who he was. Ethan greeted each of them by name. One man handed him a folder. Another briefly discussed a maintenance schedule. A third mentioned weather conditions along several transportation routes. Ethan listened carefully before answering. His voice remained calm. His gestures were minimal. Nothing about him resembled the executives Victoria dealt with every day. Then Lily tugged gently on his sleeve. "Dad?" Ethan immediately shifted his attention to her. "Yes?" She pointed toward an aircraft parked several hundred feet away. "Is that the big one?" Ethan looked in the direction she indicated. A faint smile appeared. "That is one of them." Victoria followed her gaze. Her breath caught slightly. The aircraft was not merely a private jet. It was a long-range Gulfstream capable of crossing oceans without stopping. The kind of aircraft owned by governments, multinational corporations, and individuals whose wealth rarely appeared in public rankings. Yet even that revelation was not the real surprise. The surprise came when the operations manager opened the folder and Ethan signed several documents. The manager nodded respectfully and stepped aside. Within moments, activity across the terminal began shifting. Flight crews moved. Vehicles repositioned. Schedules adjusted. An entire network appeared to respond to a single decision. Victoria watched carefully. It felt less like observing an owner and more like watching the center of a system reveal itself. For days she had assumed the aircraft represented the answer. Now she realized it was only another clue. Ethan was not important because he owned planes. He owned planes because of something much larger. As Ethan and Lily began walking toward the terminal entrance, Lily looked up at her father. "Are we still going to make it back for my science fair?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I would not miss it." Lily smiled and squeezed the rabbit tighter. The conversation lasted only seconds, but Victoria suddenly understood what Richard Collins had been trying to tell her. The companies. The aircraft. The assets. None of them were the foundation. They were the result. Everything Ethan built ultimately served one purpose. Stability for the small girl walking beside him. And standing alone inside her car, Victoria realized she had spent her entire career learning how to measure success while completely misunderstanding what success looked like. By the time Victoria returned to her office that afternoon, the acquisition itself no longer felt like the most important issue on her desk. She sat alone with the blinds partially open and Ethan's file spread across the conference table. For nearly an hour she read through documents she had previously skimmed. This time she paid attention to the details. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every company Ethan acquired had once been struggling. Every division he expanded had protected jobs rather than eliminating them. Every long-term investment prioritized stability over publicity. There were no flashy ventures. No vanity projects. No headlines announcing record-breaking purchases. The deeper she looked, the stranger it became. One report described how a regional cargo network survived an industry downturn because Ethan refused to cut critical staff despite pressure from investors. Another detailed how he quietly funded infrastructure improvements years before they became profitable. The numbers were impressive, but they were not what held her attention. It was the consistency. Ethan seemed to make decisions using a set of principles that never changed regardless of how much money was involved. Late that afternoon, Richard Collins arrived at her office carrying another folder. He placed it on the table and sat down across from her. "You finally understand why people struggle to explain him," he said. Victoria nodded slowly. "I thought I was looking at a wealthy businessman." Richard smiled faintly. "And now?" Victoria looked toward the city skyline. "Now I think the business empire is only the surface." Richard opened the folder. Inside were organizational charts connecting dozens of companies across transportation, logistics, warehousing, software infrastructure, and aviation. Victoria studied them carefully. The structure stretched across multiple states. Freight routes connected distribution hubs. Aviation assets supported cargo operations. Investment firms funded expansion. Separate companies appeared independent until the relationships were mapped together. Then the full picture emerged. Victoria sat back in silence. "He owns all of this?" Richard shook his head. "That is the part most people misunderstand." "Then explain it." Richard pointed toward the chart. "He does not own every company directly. He controls the network. That is very different." The distinction landed heavily. Ownership could be purchased. Control had to be earned. Suddenly the private jet seemed insignificant compared to the system surrounding it. The aircraft was not a symbol of wealth. It was a tool inside something much larger. At that moment Victoria's phone buzzed. Her assistant appeared in the doorway moments later. "The partners are here," she said. "They want an update." Victoria closed the folder. 20 minutes later she stood before a room filled with investors, attorneys, and executives. Normally she would have dominated the discussion. Today she found herself answering the same question repeatedly. What does Ethan Walker want? Nobody knew. Because nobody had ever bothered to ask. As the meeting ended, Victoria remained seated while the others filed out. For the first time since seeing Ethan at the law office, she felt something unfamiliar. Not frustration. Not concern. Respect. And with that respect came a realization that unsettled her more than any business risk ever had. The man she had dismissed in a single glance was not hiding behind his success. He simply never needed anyone's recognition to know exactly who he was. The following Tuesday evening, the gymnasium at Lily's elementary school filled with folding tables, science projects, and proud parents carrying paper cups of coffee. Children stood beside poster boards explaining volcanoes, solar systems, and homemade experiments involving magnets and baking soda. The room buzzed with the kind of excitement that only existed when children believed their work mattered. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early. As promised, he had cleared his schedule completely. He stood beside Lily's display while she carefully arranged her materials for the third time. "It already looks perfect," Ethan said. Lily glanced up. I know. I just want it to stay perfect. Ethan smiled faintly. Across town, Victoria sat inside a conference room surrounded by advisors reviewing final acquisition documents. The deal remained stalled. Every analysis pointed toward the same conclusion. Progress depended on Ethan Walker. Yet something had changed inside her over the past several days. She no longer viewed him as an obstacle. She viewed him as a man she had misjudged. Shortly after 6 o'clock, her phone vibrated. A message from Richard Collins appeared. It contained only an address. She stared at it for several seconds before recognizing the location. An elementary school. 40 minutes later, Victoria quietly entered the gymnasium. Nobody paid attention to her. There were no investors here. No executives. No reporters. Just families. Then she spotted Ethan standing beside Lily. He was exactly the same man she had seen at the law office. Same calm posture. Same simple clothes. Same quiet presence. The difference was that now she understood what she was looking at. Lily noticed Victoria first. "Dad," she whispered. Ethan turned. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment neither spoke. Then Victoria walked toward them. "Good evening," she said. Ethan nodded politely. "Good evening." There was no hostility in his voice. No resentment. No attempt to remind her of their first meeting. Somehow that made the moment more difficult. Victoria looked at Lily's project. "This is impressive." Lily smiled proudly. "I built most of it myself." "I believe you did." Another silence followed. Finally Victoria looked at Ethan. "I owe you an apology." Ethan said nothing. "I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you." The noise of the gymnasium seemed distant for a moment. Ethan considered her words carefully. Then he nodded once. "Most people do." There was no accusation. No bitterness. Just a simple observation. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. "Still, I was wrong." Ethan glanced toward Lily's display. "Being wrong is not the problem." Victoria waited. "Refusing to learn after being wrong is." The words landed softly, but they carried more weight than any criticism. Before she could respond, an announcement echoed through the gym. The judges had finished reviewing the projects. Excited children gathered near the front of the room. Minutes later, Lily's name was called for first place in her grade level. Her face lit up instantly. She ran forward while clutching the stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. Ethan watched her with quiet pride. Victoria watched. Ethan. In that moment she finally understood something none of the financial reports could explain. The companies, the aircraft, the influence, the wealth, all of it existed in the background. This was the center. A father keeping a promise to his daughter. As the applause filled the room, Lily returned holding her ribbon and looked up at Ethan. "You came," she said. Ethan smiled. "I told you I would." And standing there beneath the bright school gymnasium lights, surrounded by ordinary families and ordinary moments, Victoria realized that the most valuable thing Ethan Walker possessed had never been listed on a balance sheet.